The wealth of some nations, social democracy and colonialism after the Second World War. After the breakup of the International War Coalition and the development of the East-West conflict, by 1947, none of Europe's socialist parties, with the exception of the German and Italian, had a foreign policy that was any different from that of the center and center-right parties. Neither British nor French socialists had given colonialism serious consideration, with their attitudes to the colonies best summarized as, hold on to them if you can. For the French, perhaps even more than for the British, the preservation of empire was a means of strengthening France's weakened role globally. Accordingly, the French government, even when it contained both socialists and communists, did not remotely approximate an anti-colonialist force. Footnote. According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, in 1945, the French Communist Party, PCF, won 25% of the vote in France's first post-Second World War election, and in 1946 it took part in the Fourth Republic's first government. After May 1947, when the Communists were dismissed from the cabinet as a result of hardening political attitudes, the PCF did not participate in any Fourth Republic administration, though it won an average of more than 22% of the vote in the 6 general elections from June 1951 to June 1968, and won a large number of seats in the National Assembly. End of footnote. Despite a recognition that reform of the empire was imperative, nationalist movements had to be placated, and so did the U.S. anti-colonialism. Decolonization was not the objective of the French government or the French left. Just as the French left did not mention the colonies in their manifestos for the general election of October 1943, the British Labour Party's election manifesto of 1945 was equally silent on the subject of Britain's empire, despite the monumental tide of decolonization that was to sweep the world in the ensuing 2 decades. Indeed, judging by its conference resolutions and other statements, the Labour Party opposed withdrawal from the colonies. British Empire socialism, like its European counterparts, had always exercised an entrenched commitment to empire as a protected field of investment, a protected source of raw materials, a protected market for their country's exports, and a means of protecting the value of the national currency. Thus, the Labour Party favored the preservation of the white Commonwealth, based on the Ottawa system of imperial preference, with India to be allowed an indigenous government with exceptionally close economic and military ties to the United Kingdom. Between 1939 and 45, India's trade surplus with Britain was worth £1.3 billion. British overseas investment amounted to £659 million between 1948 and 51, and there was an impending run on the pound. Britain was finally forced to devalue its currency, and it used the sterling balance of its colonies to help pay off the debts it had incurred with the United States in the previous decade. Thus, for instance, after the Second World War, net dollar earners such as the Gold Coast, now Ghana, and Malaya were prevented from purchasing outside of the sterling area, in effect forcing them to hold a large surplus of sterling, the entirety of which was to be held in London. In practice, this amounted to lending to Britain at low rates of interest. As conservative British historian David K. Fieldhouse described events, beginning of long quote, "The British, while having to devalue the pound against the dollar in 1949, kept the pound strong against all colonial currencies, in most cases at par, by devaluing them at the same time and to the same extent. In short, the sterling area was used after 1945 as a device for supporting the pound sterling against the dollar. At the same time, the pound was kept strong against the colonial currencies to avoid an increase in the real burden of blocked sterling balances, that is, Britain's current account deficit with its colonies. In both ways, the colonies were compelled to subsidize Britain's post-war standard of living. The Labour government used the colonies to protect the British consumer from the high social price which continental countries were then paying for their post-war reconstruction. Consciously or not, this was to adopt social imperialism in an extreme form. End of long quote. In 1948, to protect the profits of Britain's rubber and tin industries, and thus ensure the solvency of sterling, the country's Labour government launched a massive counterinsurgency operation against the communist-led Malayan independence movement. Beginning of long quote. As a result of colonialism, Malaya was effectively owned by European, primarily British, businesses, with British capital behind most Malayan enterprises. Most importantly, 70% of the acreage of rubber estates was owned by European, primarily British, companies, compared to 29% Asian ownership. Malaya was described by one lord in 1952 as the greatest material prize in Southeast Asia, mainly due to its rubber and tin. These resources were, quote, very fortunate for Britain, another lord declared, since they have largely supported the standard of living of the people of this country and the Stirling area ever since the war ended. What we should do without Malaya and its earnings in tin and rubber, I do not know. The insurgency threatened control over this, quote, material prize. End of long quote from Curtis. The repression of Malaya's communist movement by the British Army resulted in thousands of Malayan deaths from the use of fragmentation bombs, chemical warfare, and massive forced resettlement programs, later used by the United States and Vietnam, with the covert support of the ruling British Labour government. Footnote. As the national liberation struggle against French colonialism in Vietnam drew to its inexorable conclusion, and around the same time that the U.S. government seriously considered using nuclear weapons to prop up the flailing position of its French ally, an article published in U.S. News and World Report on the 4th of April 1954 stated, quote, "One of the richest areas in the world will be open to the victor in Indochina. This is what lies behind the growing U.S. interest. Pewter, rubber, rice, strategic key primary produce are the true reasons for this war. The U.S. considers this an area in which to maintain control by any means necessary." End quote. In addition, keeping open the field of investment within the super-exploitation of cheap semi-colonial labor by monopoly investors was a major goal of the U.S. imperialists in Vietnam. As Businessweek reported on the 20th of April 1963, quote, "By the end of the 1940s, and increasingly during the 1950s up until today, American corporations in one industry after another were discovering that their foreign incomes kept increasing. Their revenues were usually substantially higher abroad than in the United States." End of long quote, and end of footnote. The secretary of the Fabian Colonial Bureau, formed in 1940, South American-born economist Rita Hindon, was conscious of the contradiction between Labour's avowedly developmentalist policies for Britain's colonies and its domestic welfare agenda. Footnote. The Fabian Society was a group of intellectuals and social reformers formed in 1884 that hugely influenced the ideology of the Independent Labour Party founded in 1893 and the Labour Party founded in 1900. End of footnote. For not only were there clear capitalist imperatives at stake in maintaining the colonies in a state of semi-feudal dependence, but the British electorate desired cheap food and cheap colonial imports at the direct expense of colonial living standards. The Labour government's priorities from 1945 to 51 were dictated by the needs of the British economy and the urgent necessity of procuring raw materials and foodstuffs and earning precious dollars from its colonies. As a consequence, the Labour government tended to prioritize colonial issues only when it was imperative to do so in the face of effective national liberation struggle. In those colonies where neither communist nor national liberation forces were particularly strong, India was written off as a colony due to the strength of both tendencies there. The labor movement sought to either delay independence or, in the worst case, ensure that the, quote, independent country retained exceptionally close political and economic ties to Britain. The Caribbean was considered particularly promising for such a strategy, since it was thought that communist influence was weak there. In the case of Africa, the Labour Party expressed its view in the 1943 pamphlet, The Colonies, wherein it was argued that the African colonies were inhabited by, quote, backward people of primitive culture who were simply not yet able to stand by themselves. Britain's rule was to be magnificently maintained as a trust for the native inhabitants until they could be deemed suitable to govern themselves. Meanwhile, the exploitation of colonial labor and the export of cheap goods and huge profits it made possible were to continue apace, as a fitting reward for Britain's labors carrying the white man's burden. The true intent behind Labour's, quote, positive colonial policy, as opposed to mere negative anti-imperialism, was announced to an unshocked House of Commons by Labour's Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and later founder of Britain's National Health Service, Ernest Bevin, in 1946. Quote, I am not prepared to sacrifice the British Empire, he said, because I know that if the British Empire fell, it would mean that the standard of life of our constituents would fall considerably. End quote. Needless to say, Labour's record of social imperialism, of ameliorating the living conditions of Britain's population by oppressing and exploiting the peoples of Africa and Asia, is of scant concern to those, quote, old-style socialists yearning for the return of the post-war welfare state. Although the domestic policy of the first majority Labour government of 1945 to 51 is considered to have been radical, the presumption has also been that its foreign policy was also progressive, particularly in light of India's achievement of independence in 1947. However, Labour was not anti-imperialists. Other than India, only Israel, Burma, and Ceylon managed to wrest their independence from Britain during that period. Labour's main concern was to either preserve the empire or, failing that, to guarantee that the post-colonial world remained safe for British capital investments. Its strategy was to kill colonial independence by kindness, that is, to provide the minimal reforms necessary to prevent the grievances of the colonized from being, quote, exploited by communists and radical nationalists. At the same time, the policy of the Trades Union Congress, TUC, in Britain was just as conservative and colonialist as that of the Labour Party. Between 1945 and 51, the period of the Third Labour government, very little was done to substantiate the trade unionist rhetoric of colonial self-government. Davis summarizes the attitude of Britain's union movement to colonialism. Beginning of long quote. Implicit racist thinking overtly nurtured in the previous 70 or so years before 1945 continued to influence the labor movement's views. The use of trade unionism to discourage the development of a pro-communist political movement, which might take advantage of the much-delayed voting rights granted in most colonies after 1945, was partially successful. Where it did not deliver compliance, the movement was crushed, as in the Malayan Federation and in Kenya. But for the most part, British-inspired trade unionism, working with the Colonial Office and through trade union labor advisors, began to take hold. Supplemented by a major program of government-funded trade union education, and later by the resources of the ICFTU, the colonial world was left safe for neocolonialism once independence had been won. End of long quote and end of section.